one bar is actually bucking the trend. This is the bar of percent of accidental deaths per age group. So it actually makes sense that 20-year-olds down here are going to die more of accidents because they're crazy than their 65-year-old counterparts.
Okay, on board.
Excellent. All right. And so now we were talking about age distribution. So now I really want to get into the nitty gritty. So if you're killed, what's the likelihood that you died from a specific disease per age group? And so this is basically looking at how many people died of COVID as a percent of the total deaths for that year. So starting over here on the left, the bars each represent the age brackets going from 1 to 4 to all the way to 65 plus as labeled here. So here you can see an exponential increase in the percent of COVID-19 deaths per total deaths when you look at the age bracket as expected. But when you put it in the context of other deaths, look here, percent accident deaths per total deaths in 2015. Almost, for this orange bar, is 15 to 24 years old. Over 40% of the deaths in the 15 to 24-year-old age bracket was from accidental deaths in 2015 versus roughly 3% of the deaths in 2020 came from COVID.
Right. So in other words, we need to, if we really want to save kids, we got to teach them how to be less dumb. Like that's essentially what this graph would say is like, if we're really going to change all of humanity to try and prevent death, and I think we can all agree that we would prefer to prevent deaths in young people to old people. I think we would all agree, like if you could save a 25-year-old versus 65-year-old, we would focus on saving the 25-year-olds. Right. Not that we should have to choose between people, but I think most people go with that preference. So if we really want to deal with the death problem in youth, we have to figure out how to make them less dumb. And we will save substantially more lives.
Right. And really, the hard numbers are really shocking here, because if you add these bars, which are just accidental deaths, with these, which are just the percent of the other non-15, and LCOD stands for leading causes of death. So these are the 15 leading causes of death. And of course, if that doesn't break the top 15 for the age group, it falls off the list. But these are the other ones. So when you combine these bars with these bars, you're talking a vast majority of the deaths are coming from diseases that don't make up the top 15 killers and accidents. So that's just something of interest.
Okay, and then in the older population, so when I'm seeing percent diabetes, percent all other just what does that mean? Non-15 LCOD, like that means non-illness, just like natural causes.
LCOD is leading causes of death. So this data only tracks the top 15 leading causes of death. So in every bracket, there's actually about anywhere from 10 to about 28%. That's actually just non-diseases, but they're so sparse and sporadic that they actually don't reach the top 15, if that makes sense.
Okay, so just at a total eyeball, about you got double the amount of deaths from heart disease in the old population than you do COVID. You've got about a 40% increase for cancer, maybe 15 for all other, and then diabetes is about maybe 5% less. So right. The idea being that I guess COVID does not necessarily, well, it certainly does not drastically exceed other illnesses, even in the most at-risk population.
Right. Right. And let's be real, like this is pretty shocking, right? But we're not even going to get into how they calculated these numbers, and you've covered a lot on your show, which I've listened to, about just you get in a car accident and you get COVID, you get marked, right?
And then the other thing to keep in mind, which I think this is what you're building towards, but the COVID-19 deaths that I'm seeing is that someone that would have been accounted for in a different category within a short period of time.
Precisely. And just to put I don't know, an ornament on it, I don't know, but look down here. So this is the percent flu deaths per total deaths in 2015 before COVID, and you can see that there's a sizable amount of the 65 plus population, so much so it shows up on the graph. Fast forward to 2020, virtually there's no people over 65 dying of the flu compared to what they were 5 years ago.
Just to give the two sides of that, visually, you can see that there's a substantial drop in flu deaths, which means that there is an accounting problem here of us over attributing COVID-19 deaths that are clearly belong to another category. However, just to give the inverse side of that,
Right.
I mean, it could be if we're stealing just visually that amount, like 20% of each deaths from each of these, then that's what constitutes the COVID-19 death chart. However, or at least let me just state this differently. If you look currently at this COVID-19 death chart in the old population, you go, holy shit, that's a substantial risk more than the flu. If, however, you look at even just the amount of flu deaths that visually it would seem are now being attributed to be COVID-19 deaths, and then you could deduce that that must also exist for heart disease or these other issues, then that might account for most of why that graph seems to be so much bigger than the flu. I do have, however, two questions for you just to make sure that we're all above board and accurate. Right. Comparing 2015 to 2020, are there any issues there in terms of, I mean, I guess we're looking at percentages here more than population. And also, you would consider that 2020 figures would be better than 2015 because there would be general health and scientific increases in medicine. I would assume that over a 5-year period, maybe there would be enough improvements in medicines where maybe your cancer deaths, would not be at the same level. So just in your opinion, I don't know enough about this field of study, but is a 2015 to 2020 comparison, like could someone basically knock this as, hey, this isn't fair because we're comparing 2015 to 2020, or is that pretty legitimate?
I would say, that's definitely kind of like an academic argument, but I would just argue that within 5 years, you're really looking at, 3 to 5 years to get a small molecule approved. You can definitely get into small emergency use authorization trials with small molecules, which I've done before. So that's just to make that point and educate everyone. The point of emergency use authorization in the context of the company I used to work for is we used to have crackpot chemists. They used to make these crazy white powders. I would solubilize them and treat cancer cells. And then if they killed cancer cells, we would put it through a process, and eventually we would treat people with that type of cancer, right? Well, it turns out if someone has that type of cancer and they're dying from it in the clinic and nothing works, then they can come to us and say, hey, let's use your experimental drug. I know you haven't tried it on pigs yet or dogs yet, maybe just on mice, but it's worth a shot. That's what an EUA is for.
So it's really supposed to be only for if you're dying anyways, that your risk of a problem from this is basically nil. You might as well just go with this because you're dying anyways. And that's supposed to be the context for emergency authorization. So the idea that a healthy 22-year-old should take something off of the back of emergency authorization is a gross misrepresentation of what emergency authorization is supposed to be.
It's disgusting, man. And that's what's even terrible. People's lives get changed because of this, right? Yes, it's a shot in the dark, but we're not back alley, crackpots, right? Like the companies that are billion-dollar companies, we're onto something, right? So sometimes our drugs work, and they work for people that are really desperate, but we're not talking about desperate people. And that's part of the reason I wanted to make this PowerPoint. But yes, exactly right.
All right. I think that was all the questions I had. I guess this would be hard to quantify, but I'm still just going to say the questions because it is coming into my head. And this might be speaking to kind of our broader view of risk.
Yeah.
I guess you could look at this, though. This is where it becomes really hard to evaluate. So COVID-19, let's just say theoretically, is significantly more contagious than the flu. Let's just say that. I don't know if that's true or not, but let's just say that to be true. So I would believe that a lot of old people might pass sooner than they otherwise would have if they have other pre-existing conditions. But the flu, let's say the flu is highly more transmittable. I can only speak about my grandfather. He's 85. I remember a year ago he got a cold, like a simple cold, and we weren't sure if he was going to pull through that cold. It took it was 4 months where he was sick and he just wasn't kicking it, and then he pulled through. Oddly enough, he got COVID and he was good in 2 weeks. But whatever. The point being, though, if you had some highly transmissible new cold and you take these people that are just generally in bad health, that could kill them off. So I guess it does become kind of hard to evaluate, or maybe you do have the numbers to break this down so did we just cut this person's life short by 2 years? Are we talking about that we cut their life short by 2 months? Which maybe you do have the breakdown of that, but I guess it becomes a little bit hard. And by the way, just to
Yeah.
speak, I mean, I'm rambling, so I'll hand it back over to
No,
you.
no, this is good.
If we know that only the 65-year-olds are at risk, and it's because they have other conditions, then the simple conclusion is, well, then let's keep those people at home and leave the 25-year-olds alone because they're not at risk, which has obviously never been the approach here. It's been everybody's got to go through this because the 65-year-olds have to go through this, which doesn't even make sense. And I'm rambling, so I'll hand it back to you.
Right. No, and just to tack on a little bit to your ramble, it's almost better to expose people to the coronavirus that are healthy, right? Because then you create more. I know herd immunity is kind of a trigger word, but the more people that get asymptomatically exposed to something, you build immunity and you're good, right? That's the whole premise of having children play in the dirt, right? Because children don't really suffer from these diseases, right? So you let them kind of get exposed to stuff that maybe I wouldn't want to eat, right? So it's the same thing.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah, and yeah, so yeah, it's great, but yeah, so I guess so moving on, and I'll just be really quick here. The orange or this graph right here is just a blow up of the percent of COVID-19 deaths per total deaths in from January 2020 to August 2021. And so this actually incorporates the Delta variant and the Alpha variant. And so as you can see, it's a little closer breakdown, and there's just a nice curve as the age groups go up. And this pie graph over here is the COVID-19 deaths per age group. So this is of the people that died of COVID, what percentage. This big chunk is 65 plus versus the 45 to 64, and you just get smaller chunks. Just a different way to visualize.
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm following. Chart on the left is if somebody died of a disease or someone died in this year, what did they die from? So over 65, about 12% of the deaths last year were because of COVID.
Right.
Okay. Correct. And so 15 to 24, so it's like 3% of deaths? That kind of seems almost high to me. So am I reading that right? So 3% of the deaths last year for 15-year-olds was because of COVID?
Well, so you got to think that not that many 15 to 24-year-olds are dying. So of the ones that did, this is the percent that died of COVID. But this isn't giving you real-world numbers. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in other words, just to state it differently, as a theoretical, if 100,000 15-year-olds die in a year, so then we're looking at 3,000 total deaths because of COVID.
Correct.
Right. Okay. And then in terms of the chart on the right, it's just the percentage of COVID deaths per age group. So it's basically it's just the death distribution showing essentially that 97% of COVID deaths are all people over the age of 45.
Right. Totally right. Yep. That's all that is. And so here's something, because we're talking about risk a lot, and this is a log scale graph, and all that means is that this y-axis is, instead of linear, it's on a log base 10. But the numbers still mean what they mean. It just can be a little bit hard to differentiate it when they fall in between. So that's why I left the graph down here. But what this graph and how I calculated this graph was I took 15 to 24-year-olds as the base case. And then from there, based on their percentage of death per COVID deaths, I then could calculate what is the risk between these different age groups from dying from COVID. So essentially, if you get COVID, what are your chances of dying from it? Or of the people that died of COVID, this is the percentage breakdown translated into risk assessment by the amount of times more or less likely than a 15 to 24-year-old you are to die of COVID.
Okay, simple enough. Just my risk compared to a 24-year-old of dying from COVID.
Right,
okay.
For age group. And if you're over the age of 65, you're about 450 times more likely to die of COVID. That's it.
Okay.
And so these are just links to the two references, and I'll link the Google Sheet later. And so now I just want to take a step back, and just because I'm really impressed, Robert, like, again, you and your listeners and your viewers, you think like scientists, and you're very logical with your thoughts. You just need to be armed with the ammo to really call out the bullshit, or at least know for sure that someone's full of bullshit. So this is just a really quick 30,000 view, especially when someone tells you that the virus is mutating in unvaccinated people. And I'll make this really quick, and please ask any questions. So and I've seen PhDs and medical doctors say